My daughter's fiancé asked about the property line 4 times in 2 months. Not casually, not once in passing, 4 times, always standing at the same kitchen window overlooking the water, always with that same relaxed smile, always waiting for my answer the way a contractor waits for a price quote. I kept telling myself he was a Toronto boy unfamiliar with cottage country. I spent 28 years as a high school nurse at a secondary school in Bracebridge, and I'd learned to recognize differences between genuine curiosity and calculation. But when the person asking is the man your daughter loves, you give him the benefit of the doubt. You have to. 6 months later, I stood at the end of our dock in front of 78 guests, my daughter in her wedding dress beside me, and I had to make a choice I never imagined making. I chose to end it. Right there, in front of everyone. I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt on a Tuesday evening in late October. He was standing at that kitchen window for the 4th time, asking very gently whether the eastern boundary stopped at the tree line or extended past it toward the road. My daughter was upstairs. It was just the two of us, and I watched his eyes move across the water the way my late husband used to look at a blueprint. Measuring, calculating, deciding what was worth taking. His name was Nolan. That was what my daughter had called him when she first brought him home. Nolan, warm smile, firm handshake, cashmere sweater that probably cost more than our annual property tax. Nolan, who remembered to bring flowers, who asked thoughtful questions about my years in school nursing, who made my daughter laugh in a way I hadn't heard since, before her father died. My husband had been gone 14 months by then, taken by a sudden heart attack at 61 while checking on a renovation project in town. He had spent 40 years in the construction and contracting business, and he had died the way he'd lived. Still working, still building something for someone else. I had not finished grieving. I was not sure I ever would. I called my solicitor the morning after Nolan's 4th question about the property line. She had handled my husband's estate and known him for 20 years. She was methodical and direct, and when I explained what I'd noticed, the questions, the pattern, the way his eyes tracked across the water, she didn't tell me I was being paranoid. She said, "How long have they been together?" 7 months, engaged after 5. She was quiet. Then she said, "Send me everything you know about him. Give me a few days." She called on the 4th day and asked me to come to the office. The folder she set on the table between us was thick enough that my hands went cold before I opened it. She told me to sit down first. His name, she said, was not Nolan. It took a moment for that to land. I asked her what she meant. His legal name was Trent Beckford. He had changed it in 2020, quietly, through a provincial process in British Columbia. The name Nolan, the surname, the entire identity, had been constructed carefully, piece by piece, starting sometime around 2019. She slid a photograph across the desk, a younger version of the face I knew, harder, thinner around the jaw. He had done this before. Twice. A woman in Vancouver in 2021, the daughter of a retired physician who had sold a waterfront property on Vancouver Island. They'd dated 5 months, been engaged for 6 weeks. The engagement ended 10 days after he attended a meeting with the family's financial planner. Her family had paid $75,000 for him to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. They hadn't gone to the police because they had no proof of intent. He had never touched a single asset directly. He had only asked questions. The second woman was in Hamilton. Her father had recently died and left her a rental portfolio. Same pattern, same timeline. 4 months of courtship, a proposal, quiet withdrawal after gaining access to financial details. Her family had paid $60,000. I thought about my daughter, her father dead. Her mother living alone at a cottage in Muskoka that had been assessed at just under $3 million. A sold business, a trust she didn't fully know the details of, A woman who still drove the same car she'd owned for 9 years because her husband had believed that showing what you had was an invitation to lose it. My solicitor leaned forward. "There's something else," she said. She had done what she called a deeper search. Trent Beckford's father had been convicted of construction fraud in Ontario in 2014. He had spent 2.5 years in a minimum security facility. The conviction had rested partly on a formal complaint filed by the lead contractor on a commercial project near Gravenhurst, a complaint filed by my husband. My husband had not destroyed the man. He had reported what he'd witnessed. Inflated invoices, substandard materials, a client left with a crumbling foundation. It was the right thing to do. But Trent Beckford had been 19 years old when his father went to prison, and families don't always make space for the difference between justice and ruin. Some people carry that kind of grief until it curdles into something else entirely. I drove home along the highway with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest hollowed out. He wasn't here for the property. He wasn't here for the money. He was here to take apart the life my husband had built, piece by piece, using my daughter to do it. My solicitor recommended a private investigator, a former OPP detective out of Orillia, retired after 22 years. He drove a nondescript gray sedan and had the kind of stillness that comes from watching people who don't know they're being watched. He shook my hand at the kitchen door and looked around the room with quiet efficiency. He installed 3 small cameras, one tucked behind the ceramic jar on the shelf above the stove, one inside the smoke detector in the front hallway, one fitted into the bookshelf in the living room between 2 field guides my husband had never finished reading. Motion activated, encrypted, and legal under Ontario law. He had confirmed all of it. "People show you who they really are," he said, "when they think the room is empty." The waiting was the hardest part. My daughter came for weekends with Nolan, and he was always helpful, always easygoing, always finding a reason to be near the kitchen when I was making tea or pouring water. I watched him from the corners of my eyes and smiled when he smiled and held every instinct steady. My GP called on the 3rd week. She had been my doctor for 11 years. He had come into the clinic, she told me. He had introduced himself as my future son-in-law and described memory lapses that didn't exist. He'd asked specific questions. What were the early signs of cognitive decline? What medications affected judgment? How was mental incapacity formally established under Ontario law? She had answered carefully and said nothing to alarm him. Then she had gone home and called me. He had also asked about zopiclone, dosages, how long it stayed in the system, what it looked like dissolved in liquid. I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up. Every cup of coffee he'd offered me, every glass of water, every moment he'd spent alone in my kitchen. My solicitor explained what a successful guardianship application could do. If I appeared cognitively impaired, confused, unsteady, unable to manage my own affairs, a court could grant him power of attorney over my finances and my property. He wouldn't need to steal anything. He would only need to make me look incapable of holding on to it. The investigator said, "Then we catch him in the act." We set the date for the 1st week of November. My daughter was in Toronto. I called Nolan and told him I'd love to have him up for dinner. Just the 2 of us to get to know each other better before the wedding. He agreed immediately. Too quickly. The evening was overcast, the kind of flat gray November sky that settles over Muskoka like a lid. I cooked a pot of beef stew, my husband's recipe, one I could make in the dark. My hands moved through the motions without thinking. My mind was somewhere else entirely. At 6:30, he arrived with a bottle of wine and that smile I had long since stopped believing. We ate. We talked about the wedding. He played the role of grateful son-in-law with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it many times over. I played happy future mother-in-law with the same precision. We were both performing. Only one of us knew it. At 7:20, I pressed 2 fingers to my temple and apologized. "I've had a headache since this afternoon," I said. "I think it's the pressure change. I'm going to lie down for a few minutes." I filled a glass with water at the kitchen tap and set it on the counter beside the kettle. Then I climbed the stairs slowly, making sure my footsteps were audible, and stopped at the top landing. The investigator had given me a small tablet showing 3 camera feeds in real time. I watched. For 5 seconds, Nolan sat at the table without moving. Then he stood, walked to the base of the stairs, and listened. Satisfied, he moved to the kitchen. He checked the window. He reached into his jacket and removed a small orange prescription bottle. He found a teaspoon in the second drawer, not the one I'd used during dinner, the back drawer, a clean spoon, and crushed a tablet against the counter surface. He poured the powder into the glass of water. He stirred. He wiped the spoon with a paper towel folded carefully before he placed it in the garbage. He returned the bottle to his pocket. He walked back to the table and sat down. 43 seconds, the camera caught every frame clearly. I waited until I heard his chair shift, then came downstairs. I moved toward the counter and reached for the glass. "Here, let me," he said, getting up. He carried the glass to me with both hands, his eyes watching me with an expression I now understood was not concern. My phone rang at that exact moment, timed precisely as we had planned. I turned away, took the dish towel from the counter, wrapped it around the glass without letting my skin touch the surface, and poured the water quietly down the drain. I set the glass in the sink, still wrapped in the cloth, and turned back to him with my phone pressed to my ear. When I faced him again, his expression had slipped. Half a second, a coldness moving behind the warmth, the way ice shifts beneath a Muskoka lake in early spring. Then the smile returned. He left shortly after. I stood at the window and watched his headlights disappear down the cottage road, and then I let myself shake. The investigator was at the door within a minute. He collected the glass, the spoon, the folded paper towel from the garbage. Chain of custody. He photographed everything in place before touching it. The lab results came back in 4 days. Zopiclone, 15 milligrams, nearly double the standard prescribed dose, colorless and tasteless in water. My doctor said it quietly over the phone, her voice controlled in the way she'd learned to be controlled when delivering news she wished she didn't have. At my age, she said, that dose could have caused falls, severe disorientation, possible respiratory complications, if I had been alone, if something had happened. We had the video. We had the lab report. We had his false identity, the warrant from British Columbia for fraud, the prior women he had targeted, and a direct line between his family's history and my late husband. The OPP detective who reviewed the file said we had more than enough to move. I asked him to wait until the wedding. Everyone looked at me the same way. I explained, if he was arrested quietly, my daughter would spend the rest of her life wondering whether we'd been wrong. She would build alternative explanations in her mind. Grief makes people desperate for the version of events that hurts least. But if it happened in front of witnesses, with the evidence laid out plainly, with the OPP present, she would have no room for doubt. The truth would be undeniable. The detective said, "I'll be there in plain clothes." My daughter called the morning of the rehearsal dinner. She wasn't herself. I could hear something held tight beneath her voice, something she was working to contain. I asked if she was all right. She said she was just nervous. She was not nervous. I saw it again at the rehearsal dinner. The way she tracked him from across the room, the way her laughter arrived half a second late, the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when he touched her arm. I had spent 28 years watching young people carry things they didn't know how to put down. I knew what it looked like. The morning of the wedding, I was in her childhood bedroom fastening the row of small buttons down the back of her dress when she went very still. "Mum," she said. I looked up at her in the mirror. Her hands were trembling. She reached into a small pocket, sewn into the lining of her dress. I had assumed it was for lip balm and withdrew a folded square of paper. She pressed it into my palm. I unfolded it. She had written 3 words in her own handwriting, the same looping print she'd used since she was a child, learning to write her name on her school folders. "Mum, help me." I looked at her. She looked at me, and then the story came out all at once, the way a held breath releases. 3 nights before the rehearsal dinner, she had tried to surprise him at his hotel in Bracebridge. She got to the hallway and heard voices through the gap in the door. His voice, and the voice of the man he'd introduced as his best man. She had stood in that hallway for 15 minutes, long enough. They had spoken about me, about the medication, about what would come next, about the cottage and what it was worth, and how long the legal process would take once the paperwork was signed. They had laughed about how straightforward the whole thing had been. She had gone back to her room. She had spent 3 days convincing herself she had misheard. She had not misheard. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. Her voice had gone steady, the same way her father's used to, when he'd made a decision and was ready to act on it. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." I held her face in both hands, the way I hadn't done since she was very small. "I already know," I said. Her eyes went wide. I told her everything: the solicitor, the investigator, the cameras, the lab results, the false name, his father, the other women he had done this to before her, all of it. She sat on the edge of her childhood bed in her wedding dress and shook for a while. I sat beside her and held her hand and let her. Then her chin came up, the same way her father's used to, and she looked at me. "What do we do?" she said. "We go out there," I said, "and we finish this." 78 people were seated along the dock and the lawn, looking out over the lake. The light on the water was pale, October gold, the particular kind that only happens in cottage country when the season is turning. The flowers were arranged. The chairs were tied with ribbon. His best man stood at the front, grinning broadly. My daughter took my arm at the path's edge. The string quartet started. We walked forward together. He was watching her with an expression that looked, from a distance, exactly like love. I had spent enough months studying that face to know the difference. The officiant moved through the opening words, the promise of commitment, the joining of 2 lives. "If anyone here knows of any reason why these 2 should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." I stood up. The murmur went through the crowd like wind across still water. His expression didn't break immediately. He was very good. He looked at me with careful patience and began to say something reassuring about nerves, about the stress of the day, about how understandable it was to feel emotional. "My daughter has something to tell you," I said. She straightened her shoulders. She had her father's posture in the moment before he said something true. She told them what she had heard outside his hotel room door. She didn't perform it. She didn't reach for drama. She stated it the way someone states a fact when they no longer have anything left to protect. He began to deflect, to call it anxiety, stress, imagination, a misunderstanding. He was fluent in that language. He had used it before. My solicitor stood from the 3rd row. She read from the file she was holding, his real name, the identity fraud warrant outstanding in British Columbia, the 2 previous women, the connection between his father's fraud conviction and my late husband's formal complaint, the camera footage obtained legally with documented chain of custody, the lab results from a certified provincial laboratory showing zopiclone dissolved in the water sample collected from my kitchen. His best man rose from the front row. The investigator was waiting at the dock entrance. The OPPP detective moved from his seat in the middle of the crowd. It was over quickly after that. The detective identified himself, stated the caution, and the handcuffs clicked in the afternoon quiet. His best man tried to move toward the dock ladder and stopped when he found there was nowhere to go. They walked them both off the dock, past them both off the dock, past the ribbon-tied-in chairs and her flower ornaments, and the guests who had come from across the province to witness a wedding. The last thing I heard him say was that it was never about the money. He was right about that, at least. My daughter and I sat on the dock after everyone had gone. The catering crew had left quietly. The tent company would return Monday. The lake had gone the color it goes in October, just before dark, flat and pewter gray, utterly still, the kind of stillness that feels earned. She was still in her wedding dress. Her flowers were in her lap. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "I know," I said. "I was trying to protect you too. We probably should have just talked to each other from the beginning." I laughed a little. She laughed too. It was the first genuinely honest sound either of us had made all day. The legal process moved steadily through the months that followed. His best man was charged as an accessory. The British Columbia warrant was confirmed. The families in Vancouver and Hamilton came forward when my solicitor reached out. Both of them willing to testify, now that there was documented evidence of a pattern, now that they were no longer standing alone in what they had experienced. He was sentenced in the spring. 4 years and 8 months. My daughter moved back to the cottage for a while. She worked remotely, took long walks along the eastern boundary he had once asked so many questions about, cooked dinners from her father's recipe cards in the evenings. She saw a counselor every Tuesday in Bracebridge. She started slowly, the way you start when the ground has shifted, and you have to learn how to trust it again. In June, she drove into town and came home with 2 wide-armed wooden Muskoka chairs, the yellow ones, the kind her father had always said we'd get around to buying eventually. She carried them down to the dock herself and set them side by side and stood back to look at them for a moment. "Dad always wanted chairs out here," she said. "He did," I said. "Then let's keep them here." I told her everything after that. The full picture, the trusts, the investment accounts, what the property had been valued at, the details her father had kept quiet for the same reasons he'd kept everything quiet. I thought she might be angry I'd never told her. Instead, she sat quietly for a while, and then she said, "He kept it hidden so that people would love us for us, and not for what we had." "Yes," I said. "And it almost worked against us in the end." "Almost," I said. That evening we sat in those yellow chairs and watched the light go off the lake in the particular order it always went. The far shore first, then the middle water, then the dock beneath us, then finally the chairs themselves. The loons called from somewhere past the tree line. A beaver was working along the eastern edge, the boundary that had always been ours. I had spent months afraid of being wrong, afraid of being right, afraid of what the truth would cost my daughter. The thing I hadn't let myself consider in all that time was what the other side of it would feel like. It felt like this: 2 chairs, the last of the light, my daughter beside me. What my husband had built was still standing. What he had protected was still whole. Not because of the trusts or the property value or the legal structures our solicitor had put in place, though those had mattered when they needed to, but because we had trusted each other in the end, even when it was the hardest possible time to do it. That was the thing worth keeping. That was what no one could ever take from us.